I'm pretty sure you know this next story, or at least how it started. August 2014, a white police officer shoots a young black man named Michael Brown in Ferguson, Missouri.
Don't shoot. Don't shoot.
The death of Michael Brown sparked protests, unrest, clashes with the police, and national and international coverage then and again after the grand jury decided not to indict the police officer. And you remember this part? A commission appointed to study the issues, social, economic, racial, that face and divide this region. A year later, it released its final report, 189 calls to action, 47 signature priorities.
What we need is not necessarily a method or a model, we need a movement. A movement for positive change throughout the St. Louis region that illustrates to the rest of the nation that racial equity is an appropriate goal that can be pursued by a metropolitan area in the heart of America, even within the context of the history of America.
That was not the end of it. Out of that commission work came Forward Through Ferguson, the organization that is still working on implementing those calls to action and keeping score. 3 years after the report came out, Forward Through Ferguson was holding a series of town hall meetings to report on the progress and lack of progress. This one was in October at the O'Fallon Park Rec Center.
How many here have heard of Forward Through Ferguson? Okay.
Kicking things off was the man who left his job at the United Way in the spring of 2018 to become the executive director, what they call the lead catalyst of Forward Through Ferguson.
That's how we got one.
His name is Yinka Faleti, and he is one interesting guy. Came over from Nigeria when you were, 7 years old?
Yes, yeah.
West Point, years in the military, law school, Bryan Cave, so you're a big downtown lawyer.
Yeah.
Why this? You know, people must say, couldn't you be making more money?
Certainly more money, for sure. But money isn't what drives me. What drives me is making change, and it really starts from my days at West Point. I mean, the crux of part of what we learned at West Point is providing leadership to this country and service to the country through the Army and beyond the Army when we're no longer in the Army. So that's where this service, this sense of wanting to serve started for me. And when I was an Army officer, I got a chance to deploy to Kuwait. Before September 11 and again after, and particularly after September 11.
That fits into what I think must be a pretty challenging job. Let's talk about Forward Through Ferguson, where we've been and where we're going. And so you step into this. What are you thinking? Where do you want to take this?
Well, we want to take this to the vision that we've put out there. We published a couple months back our action plan and a vision for St. Louis 2039. We call it hashtag STL 2039.
And that's 25 years after the shooting of Michael Brown.
That's right. 25 years, one generation. And so we set out a vision, one generation into the future, what's possible for the St. Louis region and what this region could look like. And we didn't set it out just in our own voices. We called the voices of community members all throughout this region, and we asked them, what would an equitable St. Louis look like? And you being here tonight are part of taking the step of helping. So we have a vision where in 25 years, race is no longer a determinant, that you will not be able to predict a person's life outcome because of their race. And you won't be able to predict it in health, in criminal justice, in housing, in transportation, in economics, in jobs, that race will no longer be a factor.
But this must be a job that contains a great amount of encouragement and disappointment.
Sure.
So where do you see the encouragement? Where do you see the disappointment?
Yeah. Well, we see encouragement in the region's ability to talk about this. Years ago, you couldn't get community leaders, political leaders, business leaders, even residents to even talk about, some residents, to talk about racial equity. They couldn't put racial equity in the same paragraph, much less in the same sentence, much less back to back. And so the fact that people in this region, leaders in this region, are able to articulate this as an issue for this region and something that desperately needs to be remedied is progress. The region's muscle for taking on this issue is progress. We've seen various catalysts all over the region who are working alongside us and other organizations who are taking on this issue in their respective areas.
So what did we find? First, we found that all 47 of the signature calls to action have some sort of activity, implementation activity, to their name, but only 5 of them are implemented enough for us to say that they have been achieved.
So that's progress. We've seen progress in the updated use of force statutes for fleeing suspects. That's progress. We've seen progress in educational innovative hubs. That's progress. So we've seen progress in 5 of the 47 areas. And that's good. And we should absolutely celebrate that. We should actually absolutely hold that up as an example of what's possible when we focus on this issue.
So where are the other 42 then?
There are so many.
Yeah.
One of the area we're lagging in the most is criminal justice reform. That is, from a racial equity standpoint, that is still lagging for this region. And when we talk about municipal court reform, that's one of the primary areas. There are certainly enough people who are interested. I think part of the challenge is there's a lack of robust investment in the work. So it took St. Louis generations to get to where we are, decades, centuries to get to where we are right now as a region. It's going to take time to get us out of where we are to get to a better place.
Let me go back to you and your life. How does your experience as an immigrant, success in this country, does that influence how you view this?
Absolutely, absolutely. I grew up, the first 7 years of my life were in Nigeria. And in Nigeria, there was not a single position in life that I could not envision myself being in. The president was black, our mayor was black, police chief was black, my teachers were black. There was not a position in life that I could not see myself in, for good or bad. Not that, all the black leaders were great. I mean, there were good leaders and not so good leaders, but I could see myself in that role. And I think for folks who didn't have that formative kind of sight in their life, it's difficult to see yourself potentially succeeding, to see yourself living in a good house, or having good transportation, or having good health, because you haven't seen that. You haven't seen that around you. And so I've seen what's possible. I've seen that there's a possibility that communities of color can thrive. There can be communities of color where people are doing well, where people have good health outcomes, they have good educational outcomes, they have good economic outcomes. I've seen that, and I know it's possible, not just in parts of Africa or other parts of the world, but it's possible in this country.
Do you ever hear people say, nothing will ever change in this town? Nothing will change, you're wasting your time.
We hear that all too often, and I understand that where that cynicism is coming from. We're sympathetic to that cynicism, but we can't stay there. We've got to, one, track what has changed, what is different. That's part of the purpose of this report, is to track it and then reflect it back. Because part of the challenge is there's so many organizations in this region, there's so many actors, so many people working on this. Our organization is not the only one. There are many working on this. We are the descendant of the Ferguson Commission, and so we have a specific mandate to do this work. And so we're seeing signs of change. We're seeing indicia of hope. And we call that out in the report. And so we want this report to also be inspirational to people, to see that, yes, there's a lot of work to be done. And yes, there are a lot of areas that we're still lagging behind. But my goodness, there are areas where we've made progress. And we want to take that and continue the momentum of change so that in 2 years from now, we're not just seeing 5 areas where we've made progress, we're seeing 20 areas. In 3 years' time, we're seeing 60 areas. In more time, we're seeing 89, 102. And then, one day we'll get to, wow, we've actually achieved all 189 calls to action. And that's the kind of momentum that we think is possible, we know is possible for this region.